Good morning and welcome. Today we want to ignite your creativity and show you how to make UWPs that are more immersive, engaging, and personalized than ever before. Whoops. You've seen a lot about the new design language, but what's next? For those of you who are familiar with the visual layer, you may remember that last year at Build, we introduced concepts like lighting, blur, and interaction tracker. This year, you saw those become the building blocks of the new design language with Reveal, Acrylic, and other new controls. Here, we want to show you the next wave of building blocks we're working on so that you can have some insight into where we're going and what comes next. For anyone not familiar with the Windows UI stack already, we have three main layers we generally talk about. Yesterday, you learned a lot about the framework layer. This is our XAML layer where we have patterns, controls, things that are easy to do. A lot of you are probably also familiar somewhat with the graphics layer, where we have full 3D rendering and full flexibility. Today, we're really going to focus on this middle layer, the visual layer, Windows UI composition. This is where we take some of these more advanced concepts, like, say, effects, and make them easy to apply to your framework content in XAML. You can also do things like add a simple animation to your XAML content, or, as you'll see later in this talk, some more advanced features. We have the spectrum from default to possible that you've heard probably a decent bit about this year at Build. Yesterday, you saw talks on things that are default and easy to do in markup, and maybe some easy ways that you can make your UI a little more unique. Here, we're really going to go into the realm of possible, things that take a bit more code, but we think really can make your app much more personalized and unique to your brand. So, what are we actually going to talk about today? We're going to do a bit of a deep dive into materials, motion, and depth. In the visual layer, materials are made up of chains of effects with other properties applied to them so that they behave a certain way. Motion is where we're going to go into some new features of the animation engine. Finally, we'll show you depth, some of the concepts we're starting to explore for how you can get your app to bridge the range of Windows devices. So with that, we'll kick off materials.
So how many folks in here play video games? Nice. I play first-person shooter video games, and one strong reaction I have in some of the more modern maps is when I see something like water. And I know that the minute I hit this water, things are going to change for me. I'm going to have lights dim, sounds dampen, and my motions will become slower. This creates kind of an emotional reaction for me. I will become frightened and scared there sometimes. As we think about applications, thinking outside of the basic rectangle, we're seeing more panoramic and immersive layouts. These larger scenes we see we can align to lightweight gaming concepts in applications. So if you've seen some of the other talks mentioned today, you've heard about acrylic. What is acrylic exactly?
So here we actually have the physical inspiration for acrylic that our design team used. It's a physical material that has real properties in the real world. So because it's probably a little hard to see, we're going to do this under our little light here, but you switch to number 1. Turn this on. So you saw the piece of plastic we had, and when we put it right on this image, you can see right through. As we actually lift it up, you can see that the image behind gets blurred from the actual depth and everything going on here.
Yeah. So to further kind of amplify this, as I shine the light here, you can see that the light will start to pick up different colors, and things will become more, changed and different here as these kind of two concepts work together. So this was really how the design team started with acrylic. They got some materials and started playing with them with lights. Let me put this here. So that's great. It's a piece of plastic. How does that help me with my application? I'm going to go through some examples of why this is valuable in your application using the acrylic example. So personalization is a key point of materials because they are adaptive and they can change. In this case, I have my favorite photo of my favorite vacation. And as I go out throughout my busy day at work, I see this photo kind of bleeding through, back at me as I look at different apps, and it just kind of makes my PC feel like mine. As you tie this into other building blocks, you can do things like draw out color themes and personal palettes and change the material to really adapt to your user. Branding is another opportunity. So we have seen a lot of acrylic, but what if you wanted to create something different that is kind of the key material for your application? In this case, we have a piece of ice. It kind of is like acrylic, but it's slightly different here. I could use this if I had a hockey application or a weather application.
Materials aren't just there to be pretty, they're also there to be functional. And part of that is how adaptive they are. Here, we have a material that is changing as it goes over the dark and light background like you've seen with acrylic. But here, also the state change is indicated a lot by what's happening in the video. You can see as windows go into foreground or background maximized, the material itself is responsive. We want materials to be used to describe actual functionality and give the user an indication of what's actually happening and what they're doing.
Yeah, they should really have a purpose. So that as I interact with them, they change, and they can help me know where I am in the application and know what state the current action I am taking is in. So back to the physical inspiration and lighting, and how this is really interesting for materials. As you see here, here's some of those other physical materials we were experimenting with the design team, and you get that red glow when you add lights here, and there is no red plastic here. It is a creation from the materials and lights knowing about each other and changing based on how they respond.
So materials aren't just a chain of effects. They also respond to lighting and these other properties in your scene to make them really feel like they're in the real world.
So when we talk about effect chains, if we look at acrylic, this is really the DNA that made up acrylic. It's a lot of blends, some noise, some tints, and that's all fed into an effect, a brush we have called a backdrop. I don't know if anyone here has used a backdrop brush in composition. All right. So this is a brush that will paint contents behind, much like you saw the octopus blurring. He was affected by the treatment on top. This is really complicated, and you would never come down to composition just to create acrylic because you have the wonderful XAML brush. But I want to get across the point here that this is a chain, and therefore it can be easily changed. So yeah, let's go into a demo on number 7.
So for anyone who's stopped by the Windows UI booth already, you may have seen this material creator editor, and today Kelly's going to show you a few cool custom materials that you can create here.
So here is that same chain, that DNA you saw in these kind of effect layers. And we are really work really close with our design team. So this is an internal tool we've created, and we've kind of made it feel like a popular design tool so that you can get used to the concepts of using layers in this kind of fashion. So I have my backdrop here, and there's nothing going to happen because it's just a brush hanging out. But I'll go ahead and blur it. Now we're starting to look a little bit like acrylic. I put an exclusion blend mode on there. Not a lot happens, but this will help me later in light and dark themes do the right color blending so I don't have to create an additional brush. A bit of tint so I can kind of customize to get a little more blue here. And then I add the noise, which is that scratchy kind of material. So that's acrylic, but acrylic really is just the tip of the iceberg. It's our first material. We want to explore other materials, and we want your help in kind of defining what the next material palette could be. So let's open up some others.
So the thing that's really cool here is this is actually just using composition effect APIs directly. So it looks wrapped up and pretty here, but these are really just API calls that are happening to live APIs that are available to you in the creators update already.
So using that, here we have frosted glass, very simple. And what this is doing is it is taking a 9-grid brush and blurring it. So I have an edge asset that I put in there, and then I use that as my 9-grid, and I pull it all the way out, and then I simply blur it. So this is a very simple effect, a little more lightweight. So if you want to kind of tailor to performance or other things like that, you can consider these kind of materials. But if you want to create something a little more interesting, so this is making kind of I think this is a prettier frosted glass. This is using that backdrop brush again and adding some noise and tint. So just, I'm just moving blocks around, really, in that effect chain. Do one more here. So once again, why is this important? Why is this cool? It's just a bunch of images. Really, I could fake them, create them in a design tool like this, and load them in my app. Why would I use composition? So what I have here is just a color rectangle. I've taken this rectangle and I've attached a scene lighting effect to it. And I've cranked up the specular values of this effect. So this means when a light hits it, it's going to be more shiny and more reflective. So when I put a point light on here, things change drastically. This is not something you can easily do in real time by switching assets out. Now this is still kind of dark, so I'm going to put an ambient light on there because anything that's not currently lit is black. So we'll glow that up a little bit more. And then you can see if I attach this to a mouse pointer, I can kind of mouse around here like this. And then I can start to animate. And you can see that light really changing there. So
the real power of these materials and everything in composition is that it all works together to make these really cool scene-based concepts. It's not just assets. Everything is animatable and interplays together. And if you're not familiar with the composition lighting APIs, Kelly has a great pre-record deep dive on them last year, so you can learn a lot more about them there.
So yeah, you can see where we make all the effect properties animatable. So you can just go grab a property, start to animate it, play with it, because it's when you start to move things around and kind of build these building blocks together, you get really powerful effects. So that said, we can talk more about motion.
Switch our computer.
Oh yeah.
So Kelly showed a lot of really cool materials, but they were all, for the most part, static until the very end there. So in order for these textures to really feel like they're actual physical objects, we need them to move and interact like they are as well. So motion can really help sell the story that these software screens are physical things. Motion can also just in general be used to make your app a lot more engaging. So this is one of my favorite examples of how motion can really keep you engaged. For anyone who doesn't recognize this animation, it's the 3 little dots you get when you're waiting for someone to text you back. And it's my favorite animation for this situation because I've probably spent an embarrassing amount of time staring at my phone, looking at these dots, waiting to see what someone's going to say to me.
I get very excited when I see these dots.
Like in the situation that you should totally put your phone down, you just stare at it because of these, and you're excited to see what you're going to hear. Motion's also really great for conveying information. Here we have a map where we have a start, an end, and a route in between. The static image tells us a little bit about where we started and where we're going. But when you see it animate, you get so much more context of how you're getting there, where you started, and where you're going. This is kind of a simple data visualization example, but you can imagine the same applies to a transition within your app. You start on page 1, navigate to page 2, and bringing people along the way gives them so much more context of where they started, where they're going, how they got there, and it's a lot more intuitive to use. Motion's also really great for creating natural interactions. When touchscreens became popular a few years ago, all of a sudden touch scrolling became the primary way we interact with these devices. Whenever I use a laptop that doesn't have touch, all of a sudden I'm confused that I can't touch the screen and move things. So as we move into more of a MR mixed reality environment, having these natural interactions continue there are really important for things to actually feel like they coexist and respond and react the way we do. And motion is a really important part of that. So with that, we will go on to some motion demos. So if we go to number 8.
Oopsie.
So here we have a couple different materials that Kelly created in the editor, and we plopped them on in here because, like we said, they're just effect chains in there that we can paint into our brushes over here. And we have in our top left corner this kind of cast iron. It's not very reflective. Here we have one of those glass textures. We have our gold. And each of these in real life would have slightly different physical properties. So if any of them are to animate, we expect them to behave a little differently. So let's actually see what they do. Here we have our cast iron. So it's a little heavier. Here we have our glass, which we have a little, it's transparent and lighter. Here we have our, what did you want to call this one? Dried ground?
Yeah. Bark was a weird one.
And then our gold. So when I do these one at a time, you may not be able to tell, but if I kind of fire them all together here, you can see each of them behaves a little differently, lighter or heavier.
And there they are being adaptive again, too. As they come closer to the light, they change.
So how are we actually doing this? I'm going to go ahead and stop that so you can actually see everything. So we're leveraging a new feature of the animation engine called natural motion animations. So we've heard a lot of you interested in physics for a while, and this is our simple physics API that we're introducing in the Fall Creators Update. So if you haven't already, you'll see it soon in Insider Flights. So here we're creating a simple natural motion animation and setting its final position and initial velocity. So this is really great because we're giving you a physics API that doesn't require you to be a physics expert to use it. So hopefully that helps. Here we are just animating the offset of our objects. And if you look at where I'm actually calling this, you'll notice that we're just inserting an initial velocity into our z value of the offset. So this brings us to another really interesting point, that all of our composition objects are really, for the most part, scene-based. So the way I actually got these squares to animate in z-space was by putting a perspective transform at the root of my tree. By doing that, simply animating the z offset makes these objects really feel like they're moving through space. You'll see from my animation, there was no scale animation, no explicit light animation, but when I animate these objects, they get smaller because they're physically moving back in z-space. And the light responds because it's closer to me, so as the objects move further away, you'll see that the light goes and responds as I expect it to. So as we move into some of these more scene-based concepts, they play together really nicely and make your app a lot more dynamic.
And these are, even though we're kind of in the possible realm, these composition or visual layer APIs are still pretty easy to use. So you should come down there and check it out for sure.
So our first natural motion animation that you see here is a spring, but there will be a handful of other easy-to-use constructs as well, so stay tuned for this. So our next motion demo is kind of a interesting, we have our depth UI here with a couple drop shadows. We've moved things forward in z-space again, and we've added a bit of parallax. So it's a little probably gratuitous to have this many layers stacked like this in your UI, but it's a cool point. So here we actually have some velocity-based parallax. Let me restart this because I don't know what it's doing.
Yeah, so you also notice as those layers were stacking up, it was really that drop shadow that created that illusion for you.
Yeah. And now they're moving tied to my finger velocity as I would expect them to if they were actually stacked and connected by, say, springs or something. So this is pretty cool, and for anyone who doesn't know, parallax is when we have these layers moving at different rates, and most of the time we do it based on position. Here we've actually done it based on velocity, which is kind of cool because they'll expand further if you move really quickly and not quite as much if you go slowly. So let's look at how we actually did this. We used the starting value of the offset for our objects, and we referenced this tracker, which is how we use input in our expression animations. And for anyone unfamiliar with expression animations, they're an animation type in composition where you can make your animations reference-based rather than time-based. So instead of using like wall clock time to tick an animation forward, here we're using the user input. And off of that input, we're referencing the velocity. Then we multiply by the index, which indicates which z layer it's in, and divide by 100 to correct for our units. Now, who here's actually ever tried authoring an expression animation? So for those of you who haven't, or those of you who have, you may know the string may not be the easiest thing in the world to come up with and get right. So today we also want to show you a new animation feature that makes authoring these much easier. So as of today, or maybe last night, in the Windows UI Dev Labs GitHub, you have what's called the Expression Builder. This is something we've introduced to give you IntelliSense and type matching for your expression animations, and it's available to you today. We've also updated all the samples in the gallery to use this library, so you have plenty of examples available to you now. So let's actually take a look at what this does for me. So I'm going to go ahead and make parallax expression 2 that does the same thing, but isn't a magic string, as we've heard them called. So I know I'm looking for a value because I start with starting value. So if I click here, I know I want an expression value. And I know I want a starting value. And I'm looking for a scalar because I'm just animating a single horizontal offset. So for all of that, I got my IntelliSense. Then I go ahead and add to that my tracker. And I need a reference to it. So this is to kind of replace these lines above where I'm setting reference parameters. And then I can actually just go access my position, velocity, and pixels per second. And I made a typo doing this the first time, so this was really helpful. And then if I want to go ahead and multiply that by my index and divide by 100, or we'll do 50 to make it look a little different. Now, I've clearly done something wrong because I have this giant red squiggly.
Yeah, you did.
So when I hover over, I can actually see that my problem here is that this operator doesn't work between an int and a vector 3. So I know I went back up here, and I forgot to do my .x. So for anyone who's done this before, I would have otherwise not found that until I actually ran the application and went to compile it. So yeah. And we'll switch this over to use parallax expression 2, and I modified this number, so it'll probably look a little ridiculous, but to prove that this actually works and I didn't just make something up.
It's going to be pretty parallaxy in there.
And this demo is also available at our booth. It's like actually really fun to play with and see all the layers stacked, so you should check it out. So now you can see my parallax is super exaggerated, and my expression builder actually did it. Woo! All right. So parallax is a really simple way to portray depth, and you've heard a lot about it here, but there's a lot of more future-looking and other concepts we're exploring in the realm of depth.
So depth is a really kind of obscure and very infinite kind of concept for us to think about and try to explain in the visual layer, but we do have a few scene, what we keep referring to as scene-based, and we have a few of these scene-based features in our APIs. So composition scenes are things like, scene objects are things like lights, the perspective transforms, and coming soon in future flights, projected shadows, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The important thing is, once again, things in this scene know about and respond to each other. So we can look at a few of these scene-based concepts. So here's perspective. And this is really where everything kind of transforms to the scene using that perspective transform, which is really similar to a camera. So things get smaller and larger as they move through Z space here.
So like we showed in the material demo, we didn't necessarily have to put animations on scale, put animations on the light position, put animations on everything. Setting them up in the right spot and then animating the squares caused the squares to just behave the way they should based on their position in space.
And then, yeah, future features, projected shadows. So this, if you've used a drop shadow in composition, you know it is per visual. So you have to go in and add drop shadows to every visual you wish to have that treatment. This will be scene-based, so you actually can set up a perceived light source and then have casters, which are the visuals that will cast the shadows, and receivers who receive shadows, so you can opt visuals in and out of the shadow treatment. This is similar to our lighting model where you have just this global object that can impact all the visuals below it. So we should, these are nice concepts or anything, but we have some more exploratory and kind of early evaluation demos we want to show you. Don't look for these APIs, you won't find them.
So first we have our projected shadows.
Number
8. So like Kelly mentioned, if anyone's been using the visual layer today, you know we have the basic drop shadow API. You can see that here. This visual is clearly moved forward in space. It has a subtle shadow around it. You can tell that it's kind of living a layer above all the others. But each of these objects is clearly independent. They're not really aware of each other and responding to each other. So if we go ahead and enable our projected shadows prototype, when we click on multiple objects, we can see that they actually have these shadows that are responding to almost an implicit light source.
That was right.
imagine, yeah, a flashlight at the root here. So it's kind of cool, and you'll notice that if we like move our position, imagine, we're moving the flashlight to the side, the shadows are responding the way you expect them to. And like Kelly said, having these scene-based concepts really makes it feel like these things are living in one world and responding and interacting with each other the way you expect them to, instead of just living in this 2D box that we're staring at. You can also see, like she said, this background has opted out of getting cast a shadow to make it feel like it's even further back in space than these other teal layers below.
Yeah, sometimes no shadows and then shadows is better than a ton of shadows.
So we're really excited to start moving more and more into these scene-based concepts. So another thing we wanted to show. Yes, I would like to stop debugging. So for those of you who saw some of our talks last year or maybe already follow us on Twitter, this demo may be familiar to you. It's one of the first kind of depth-based samples we built. We have a perspective transform here with all of our objects laid out in 3D space. And you can tell, again, as they move further back, they're smaller and everything like that. But at this point, this one's already been there for a while. Go back to that, yeah. So what we did is put this together with the exploration and prototype that our team is working on to see what this could look like in an MR environment, mixed reality. So this is the same 2D app, but because we've been aware of depth and Z-space, when we put it into this mixed reality environment, we see that it actually feels like we have some depth. You can see into the window, and it feels like there's something there. It's not just a flat screen that we've painted into. So this is living inside the Cliff House, and so the area around isn't the flat 2D app. It's just this one same sample gallery that we already showed. But you can see me in the corner there, and as I move my head around, I get a different perspective on the scene, and everything is responding the way you would expect it to in the real world, all by being aware of depth and Z-space in my 2D application.
And it's just nice to know that these things actually work cross-device. So it's kind of the beauty of UWP is moving cross-device and having things just work.
Oh, yeah.
So while we're on the subject of depth, we have, this is kind of a doozy for depth here. If you think about gaming concepts, Skybox is the actual world you run around in. And the sunset in the back, you never have to redraw that because it's infinite. You would put this in a 2D space if you want to break up really complicated UI and create immersion. So this is a feature that is currently in development, so you'll be able to feed composition a set of 6 images, and we'll create skyboxes for you. If you put local skyboxes inside of larger skyboxes, you can create little portals, and people can go into those and look around the sense of a room. So let's look a little bit more at this format. So yeah, this is the basic concept here is I have 6 assets that I can load in. Here I'm doing it with a surface brush. I just have one here, but I've given it the position of where it's going to be. So this will drive the layout of the cube. So you can kind of see if I folded this thing up, it would turn into a box. And then you don't have to really worry about how massive these sides are. We can just draw those out in the XYZ space here for you. So the position drives all the layout. No need to scale. So I create my skybox here. I'm calling it my cube faces. So I fed those assets in, and now I'm actually going to create the skyboxes. So I target that cube as my skybox, put it at the top of my root, insert at top. And then to take it a little farther, we're going to add support for an environment light. So now I can actually use this cube as a light source. And when I place objects inside this cube, they will respond to that light. This works.
So the same way that when we had the acrylic above our octopus and the octopus wasn't changing, but the acrylic being there made it feel like it was. It's the same situation where the objects around it are causing the things inside to respond differently.
Yeah, and this is just another light type in composition light APIs. So we'll just add it there, and we'll target that cube, and you're done. So to put it kind of with a visual example here, I have my assets, my content, as it were, and I add my assets to create a room. When I draw that out, I have my skybox here, so my assets are living in my room. If I target the environment light, if I target the room with the environment light, the assets will respond to the light. But it's kind of a gray room. I'm not getting a lot of light there, so I can swap out the 6 assets. So I'll use 6 of these gradients. And used as with an environment light, you can see I get a little bit more of that green light poking through and affecting the assets in the room. So that's nice in concept. We've showed you a lot of motion, materials, and all these kind of high-level concepts. We're going to now pull this all together for you in application.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about materials and motion and depth independently and shown some point demos of each one. So we want to take these and apply them to an actual application, and you can see how they really take it from something that is a relatively nice standard UWP into something that's much more immersive and unique to what we're trying to portray. So with that,
Number
8. So you've seen a handful of talks today that showed you how to take an app from one state into what we're now calling the Fluent design language. So here we have an app where we've already taken advantage of some of these Fluent concepts. So we have a gallery, we have a couple artists. Each artist is, if you click on them, going to have kind of their own page. And we've pulled the background image to make that kind of nice, applied a nice blur to it. If we go into, say, maybe our photography section, you notice we have a subtle show animation. When we scroll, we get a parallax and blur here. And
so it's a nice place you go to buy art.
Exactly.
Maybe I want to buy something.
If I go in to look at one of the images, I have an acrylic panel here and a reveal treatment on my buy button to kind of make it stand out. So it's a nice art buying app where I can explore the gallery, I can look at different artists and get a little bit of sense of their personality and go to different art sections if I want to browse that way. And all along the way, similarly, we have our connected animations here. A lot of just treatment throughout the app to make it, take advantage of these new design concepts.
That trustial blur in the background, right?
Yeah, exactly.
All that good stuff.
So this is great, but I think we can probably do a little better.
So would you say this is kind of like taking Fluent concepts? So we'll take an app that is part of Fluent design, and we're going to take it to the next level of design. It's kind of the goal here.
So we'll go back and show what each of these are doing. But first, let's add a little bit of depth into this gallery. So when we go ahead and rebuild this, you'll see that we've taken advantage of the skybox concept that Kelly mentioned. So when we relaunch, we have a skybox in our background now. When I go into each artist's room, we get their gallery, and it is a room that feels like I've entered their section of the gallery. It's really personal. I know that this is kind of the vibe of this artist that I'm looking at. When I go into a different room, I have a different artist's works there. And some of this could maybe be done with a 2D asset, so just to prove that it's not, I'm going to look around the room here by animating my perspective.
So this really feels now like you're more immersed in an art gallery. Those are kind of those real experiences that, really, we're just coming here to buy art, but why is this so much better? Because it feels real. People like things that feel real.
So as we've said throughout the talk, there's a lot of cool things you can do visually. But even just now, adding motion made all of you believe me a whole lot more. So let's go and add a few more animations to this. So now when we move between rooms in our gallery or between different sections of our art, you'll see that it really gets more of the feeling of moving around. So now when I go into this gallery, let's see what it looks like. So not only am I going from one room to the next, but I'm actually animating to get there. I feel like I'm going into a different section. It's not just swapping out assets behind me, anything like that. And when I go back to my main room, go back into his room, and I get a bit more.
So you might see, if there's a little liner in there or something like that. This is still early development, right? So we're going to get those maps smoothed up for you, but this is working code right now.
Yeah. And as we go around our gallery to different pivots, say we want to look at the illustrations or the graphic art or the photography, we'll rotate around and really get the impression that we're in this section or looking at this wall of this type of art.
It just makes the app feel so much bigger. And if you just had content in long scrolling lists, because as apps become more complicated, we don't want to think about navigation only as I'm scrolling and I'm scrolling and I'm scrolling and I'm scrolling. We can think about how we can slice and dice things into layers and make them more interesting ways to serve up the content. It becomes very focused and contextual for the user.
So similarly here, it's not just a scrolling list with my basic 2D parallax. We've actually hooked this up to our camera so that the room tilts as I scroll down or back up. So that, again, we're getting this really immersive feel where it feels like we're in the gallery and part of this experience. Now, there's a couple last things we want to do to make this even more customized. So we're going to add a few effects. All right, so do you want to talk about the focus rec? It's your favorite part.
Yeah, so I'm always really bothered by the level of focus that we have. So we've used that frosted glass material here to highlight the object that you're selecting. So here you're using a material to kind of provide focus. You don't want to reveal here, right? It'd be kind of weird to just, hey, there's lights. This is really like, this is the guy you want. I'm anchored to this. I can open it and interact with it, and I know that for sure.
We also, on the topic of focus effects, have added a custom kind of background fade here. When I go to click on one of my images, say this one, I get this gray smoke screen in the background where we've made a custom brush with a custom effect chain so that we really focus you on the picture you're trying to buy instead of being distracted by the background. Also, when we move our mouse, we go ahead and pull up a panel here, and you can see we're still using our acrylic, but we're actually pulling a color from the image we've selected to customize it to really match what we're doing. And in this case, there's also actually some logic that's pulling a high contrast color for the text and a secondary color for the buy button. But we get this experience that really fits the painting that I've pulled up, rather than just using the stock acrylic for everything.
Let's pull up another one. Let's see if there's more colors.
Let's see. Which one should we try?
That guy.
This guy. So he has a different color palette, you can see. And if we go into maybe back here, you can see some neat maps. So each of them has their own kind of personalized set of colors and different things that really fit the color palette and vibe of that particular one. There's also, I don't see them right now, so I'm going to relaunch this. Not quite finished products yet, so sorry, bear with us. There's also some subtle ambient moving visuals in the background that hopefully will come back to life. And this is something we've built to be kind of similar to a particle system, but it's really just visuals that we've animated around with a little bit of natural feeling motion and randomization. So I don't know where they went.
Maybe we'll look at the code and see where they went.
Yeah, we'll come back to them. So the first thing we did here was split from a 2D asset to this more 3D skybox. So let's take a look at what that's going to look like. Kelly showed you some of this code in slides, but here we have sort of an early version. And as you can tell, we're just loading in our assets to our skybox positioning. And because this is something that we've built in, all of the perspective transforms and layout and aligning those images is taken care of for you. So here, they're all laid out in 3D space in a box shape, like Kelly described. And we're just loading our 6 assets. Obviously, we have this code in a few different places for the artist rooms as well, but this proves the point for the main room. So you'll just see that we loaded in our front, bottom, left, right, top, back, and it laid them out as you would expect, again, because we have that perspective transform. Here, we've actually wrapped up all of our perspective transform code into a camera helper. We're not actually shipping a composition camera, but we are going to post this sample code, so you can go check out that file and see how we did it and how you may want to use it. It's one of the areas that we're still exploring. So if you do check out the code, definitely give us feedback on what you like, what you don't like. Some of the other things we wanted to call out here. You saw us do that parallax effect, right? We had a 2D parallax when we were in the 2D version of our app. And when we went into the 3D version, we were animating the camera's pitch instead. So if we check out our 2D parallax code, it's relatively standard for anyone who's familiar with expression animations. And for those who aren't, the quick description here is that we're taking the scroller translation, multiplying it by a parallax factor. Oh, this is my 3D one. Taking our scroller Y translation, multiplying it by a parallax factor, and clamping it to some region so that I don't, go past where the image exists. And then we just apply that to the translation Y of our visual. In the case of our 3D one, we actually take the same expression here, and instead of applying it to our visual's offset, we're applying it to the camera pitch. So it's really a very, very similar concept, but because we have all these transforms and stuff going on behind the scenes, it gives a much more depth-centric impression of the same effect.
It's kind of like the new parallax, right? Because
Exactly.
now I don't just have to do this thing, I can do this thing, that way, and I have depth there too.
And we did something similar for our horizontal pivots, like if you recall when we were spinning around the room. And like I said, there's not actually a camera object, but when we created our kind of helper class, we gave these animatable properties to the camera, and those under the cover are just animating transforms of visuals. So a lot, like we've said, a lot of the composition APIs are really the building blocks that, as you glue them together, enable you to build these really end-to-end experiences. We don't necessarily dictate the policy of exactly what you should do and how you should do it, but we want to give you all the tools in the toolkit so that you can build the experience that's right for your app. So the other thing we wanted to show here was some of the, if you remember, we had that effect to draw our focus, the gray kind of smoke screen in the background. So to do that, we created this overlay brush, where it's just a simple effect chain like we showed earlier. And here we're taking advantage of a new feature called the XAML Composition Base Brush. The thing that's really neat about this is that rather than needing to access like the composition visual and put something into your tree and put the brush in there, you can actually paint it directly onto your XAML content. So here we've made this custom brush, and when we go to our detail overlay, which is where we use it, we just reference our overlay brush, and it puts it right into the background of our grid. So that's one of the places where we've started making some of these concepts a bit easier and more familiar for people to use if you aren't necessarily used to dealing in visual layer code.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about acrylic, that started with us just doing blurs and adding transparency, and we work very closely with XAML and tweak that recipe to get it right so it can become a control or a common pattern. But we have to work together to figure out the best way to tweak it, and that's why we'd like to work with our developer community in particular to understand how you guys want to tweak these things, what you want to do with them, so we can kind of form patterns and controls together for everyone.
Like we said, a lot of these features are the new building blocks that next year we hope to see, at Build in these higher level constructs again. So getting more and more ideas of how you want to use them is super helpful. So let's see if our ambient moving visuals have come back. I don't know if they do or not, but it's my best shot. But like we said, if not, all of this, a version of all the apps we're showing today will become available on our Windows UI Dev Labs GitHub. And this 3D art gallery is actually going to be at the Windows UI booth later today. So if you want to go play around with it more, you can. Oh, they're there. So we have some of these kind of floating particle-esque guys in the background. And if you see them moving around, they just add a little bit of a sense of depth. And as we showed earlier, if I zoom in, all these things in the scene actually respond. So you can see I'm actually moving through Z space, and as I go past different particle guys, they disappear or become bigger or smaller. So, yeah. So definitely feel free to swing by our booth and check these things out. There's a lot of code that goes into this. Like we said, this is some of the more advanced features, but as you can tell, applying them all to your application really took this app from being a 2D standard application experience into what really felt like we were in a gallery going through different artists' works and exploring and being able to really feel like we're aware of what we're buying and how that would fit into our app. So.
Are we done coding?
Yep, we're done coding.
All right.
So wrapping up, there's a little bit of a peek into the future of other things we're looking at in the visual layer. There's, as you can tell, shapes is really big, and you'll see why when we get to the next slide. But we talked about particle systems briefly. We have a lot of seamless transitions coming. Depth sorting, a lot of these 2D but depth-based concepts you have to do a little bit of extra work to get the right visual drawing on top. We want to make that a lot easier for you and really just enable all of these things much more easily. And that brings us to our next slide of we really do listen to your feedback, and that's how we decide the next thing to go do. So we've taken a couple screenshots here of all the feedback we've gotten around wanting animated vector graphics and shapes in the visual layer. And we really do listen to them and have filed a backlog item. So feel free to upvote any of the things that you see here or create new entries for them. The great thing when we introduce things in the visual layer is that they take advantage of everything we've shown you: effects, animations, interactions, shadows, lighting. All of these things play together, and we don't introduce anything that doesn't all work together.
Yeah, so a shape will just be another building block that you can go and put effects on and light them up and do all sorts of things with.
So with that, like we said, please come join us. Follow us on Twitter at Windows UI. Like we said, we'll be posting the code, and we'll make sure to tweet out as we get these things kind of cleaned up and posted for your consumption, because we only want to post things that'll run on insider builds. We also invite you to join our newsletter. It's a great way to kind of get updates from us on cool things we're working on and things that we think you may find interesting. And like we said, check out the code. We have a lot of samples up there already, the things you've seen at our booth, but there's more to come, and the demos from both this talk and other talks that we've done at Build will be available online.
Yeah, we'll be at the booth today, noon to 3. We
Yeah,
can show you a lot more materials and kind of go through these Skybox things if you want to learn more about them. And there's a lot of related content. We've had quite a few talks here. Some of the sessions yesterday with the new design language and XAML, those will be available on demand. I think they should be available today. If you haven't seen those, the ones that James and Ashish and Tim and Paul did, yes. And then we also have some theater sessions where we say we do want to work with our development community, and we have a co-engineering effort where we go, you can talk to us, we'll help you, we'll make your app better, you'll help us make our API better. And Lindsay did a talk yesterday with Bullclip where she's been, on the phone helping write code and get things right there. So, and the app looks great, and it helps shape our APIs as well.
You should also, there's a couple pre-recorded sessions from this year, but like we mentioned also last year, we did deep dives on concepts like expression animations, interaction tracker, lighting, effects. So if any of that was new content for you, you should definitely go check those out, because you'll get a lot more context of what they are and how to use them. So we definitely are looking forward to seeing what you create, how you make your application more unique and customized, and help us shape the next wave of our design language to figure out what we should make easier to do, what we should patternize.
So please fill out an evaluation, and thank you very much for making it early this morning on a Friday. We really appreciate it. Thank you.